Everybody, it's Larry Johnson, your host with the Eight Principles Voices podcast. And I'm delighted to have with me as my guest Seth Cohen, who, among other things, and we'll get into some of the other things, is the headmaster at Jupiter Christian School in Jupiter, Florida. And for those of you not familiar with the Floridian geography, it's just a hair's breadth, I guess, north of Palm Beach. So, welcome, Seth.
Thank you, Larry. It's great to be with you.
Well, I met Seth a few months ago, and his story just is fascinating for me. And of course, we share some things that we like, cigars, whiskey, those kinds of things. And he spent some time in the Dominican Republic, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But Seth, I was very impressed isn't the word. I was very moved is a better word about your background and how you came to faith, how you are, who you are now, your lineage. I think you'll recall that when we first spoke on the phone, I said, with a name like Cohen, I suspect you're a son of Abraham. And you said, yes, Larry, but my mother was a Samaritan. And then it went from there. And I just find that fascinating. And so tell us a little bit about your background, how you grew up.
Yeah, thank you. So my dad is 100% Russian Jew. Our family started in Brooklyn and moved out to Long Island. My dad finished the Jewish migration, Brooklyn, Long Island, West Palm. That's where he finished up his life. But my mom is what we would refer to as a goyim, a non-Jew, and they were married and kind of grew up in a home that did a little of everything, celebrating, traditional Jewish holidays with part of the family, and then on the other side of the family would do your more Christian holidays. But we didn't take church going very seriously, or synagogue attendance, though we did both, and have fond memories of that. Learned a lot attending, Shabbat services Friday night at synagogue with my grandparents, or going to church now and then with my mom. But when I was graduating or finishing elementary school, sixth grade, I was to be left back because I wasn't doing well in school. I wasn't behaving well, and I wasn't doing well. And at that point, my mom took me to a neighborhood Christian school run by the Christian Reformed Church, the CRC, in West Sayville, Long Island, called West Sayville Christian School. And my mom went there, and before we went in, she said, whatever this man asks you, you say yes. And so he said, do you believe this? Do you believe that? Where do you go to church? My mom said, Peace Lutheran Church. And we attended there now and then. And my guess is the principal saw through, but somehow he had compassion on me. And I was really hopeful to get in because all my friends were leaving to go to middle school, and I was going to have to stay back, which, I think I'd rather die.
Well, at that age, especially, yeah.
Yeah, it was just terrible. And so I ended up at this little Christian school. And from there, I went there for 3 years, and then I finished at the Stony Brook School.
That's a fine institution.
Which has a tremendous reputation. I'm not sure at that point I was helping their reputation. I was an enabler. I enabled the top half of the class to be in the top half.
Well, Seth, if Billy Graham's son can get ejected for behavior, you're not too bad. Okay. All right. So yeah.
I came to faith at the Stony Brook School through coaches and teachers, and from there I went on to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. And so, but that for me, that story is just God's faithfulness. That my Heavenly Father had a plan, and He was just really faithful to me.
So you never bar mitzvahed then?
No.
Okay. So how were relations with your family when you came to faith?
My parents were very open to and supportive of the choices I've made. It was not we were not conservative or in the traditions. So, it was when my dad married my mom, it was a big deal on both sides of the family. Like
Hmm.
when my dad married a non-Jew, that was a big deal, and the other side of the family wasn't particularly pleased that my mother was marrying a Jew. Um, but a whole generation later, it's a very different situation.
Oh yeah.
And my dad's was typical of, I think, much of American Jewry in the sense of, even they go to temple and bar mitzvah, but they're culturally, they're culturally Jewish, but not necessarily religious. As you could be culturally Episcopalian or any, culturally Presbyterian, and not necessarily take the
Yeah.
faith serious. So it wasn't a big deal, but they were very supportive of the choices.
Okay. You'll find this interesting, Seth. I know a man in Long Island, and I think it's Long Island, and he's Orthodox, and he owns a public relations firm. And I love talking to my Jewish cousins and brethren because they have such a unique insight. And he says to me, Larry, my people have a lot to answer for. We were called to be the light into the world, and we have not done that. That's from the mouth of an Orthodox Jew. So there's a lot of variation out there. I mean, that's a very authentic statement to say that. Like, this is what we were called to do, and yet it hasn't happened. So anyway, it's a casual comment. So okay, so you finish your schooling. Did you go right into education? What was your?
My so my wife also graduated from the Stony Brook School.
Okay.
Um, and she happened. We were friends. It's not a big school, maybe 85 in the senior class, but a number of us from Stony Brook went to Wheaton. I think there were 4 or 5 of us that went to Wheaton. So my wife happened to go to Wheaton. Um, in the sense of she wasn't going. We didn't go together. But we were friends and actually became very good friends through my freshman year. And then at the end of my freshman year, just as my sophomore year started, I decided we had never been on a date or anything, but I was going to marry this young lady.
Oh
And
no. And I presume she had something to say about this.
well, it took her a little while. She wasn't quite on the plan right away, but yeah, we were married. And then our first job coming out of college, we were house parents in a residential foster care in Northwest Chicago.
Oh wow.
And that was quite an experience. And it was actually there that we really saw the need for quality foster care, because there weren't, when children were in crisis, there weren't enough foster homes. And so they ended up creating residential foster care where like we had 10 boys that we cared for, ages like 7 to 18 on
Oh
this floor.
wow.
And they lived in, and we were the house parents. And so when we actually so we did that for a year, and then I went back to the Stony Brook School to work. And I worked at Stony Brook for 6 years, and that's when we became foster parents. And so my first 2 children came out of the Bronx through foster care, and then we adopted them. So I was at Stony Brook for 6 years.
Okay.
And yeah.
Well, I have a friend here. Well, he's a colleague. There's a gentleman here that's created a nonprofit, and it's a model he wants to replicate nationally, Seth, where he provides that after a child ages out of the foster system, what do they do next? What kind of career options, what kind of guidance do they get? And apparently they don't get very much. And so he's creating this, it's faith-based on what is that next step after they're sort of just dumped out of the system. And so just FYI, he's looking to take it nationally. So then you've been in Christian education essentially most of your career.
Yeah, so for 36 years I've been in Christian
Okay.
education.
Okay. And then you spent, we just were speaking, you spent 9 years in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, before the DR, I was recruited by a gentleman by the name of Tony Campolo, which
Oh, yes,
know.
I know Tony. Yes.
And yeah, just recently passed. But I was recruited by Tony to come to Philadelphia, and I worked for 2 years at Cornerstone Christian Academy as the assistant head of school in Southwest Philadelphia. And so I sort of at a young age got a start in educational leadership. And it was one of those situations where it wasn't necessarily, if you saw me when I was 27, thought like, oh, I can't believe he's not a assistant head of school already. It was more like, can we find a big enough sucker to take this job? And they're like, yes. We found him. He's in New York. He said he'll come and do this. So I had while at Stony Brook, I had worked on an MBA, and I had planned on moving to Philadelphia to do a PhD in economics at Temple University.
Oh,
I
really?
was going to leave Christian education. And then, in typical fashion for people who come into contact with Tony, um, he convinced me that Christian education was my calling. And and so I did. I was with Tony for 2 years, then I moved to be head of school at a Christian school, which merged with other schools while I was in leadership, and eventually it's known now as the city school. And I was
Okay.
there for 15 years as the head of school. Um, and
Well,
then
my acquaintance with Tony, I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, and he came to speak at our parish. Now, imagine your typical WASP Anglican parish, and Campolo shows up to deliver the sermon. That was a kind of a culture shift right there. That's what I remember about it. He just exuded energy. It just and he was so passionate about everything. And let's just say he really woke the congregation up. They couldn't sleep then. And I
well, I would tell
remember
you,
that.
I didn't always agree with everything Tony taught, but just getting to know him and his wife Peggy, um, when I think of the word integrity, um, comes from the word integer, whole number, and it's wholeness, where what you say, what you think, what you do is all aligned. There's wholeness there. And Tony had the highest of integrity. He lived as he spoke, as he taught, um, he was not, even though I remember when I was working for him, his assistant called me to cancel a meeting because he was still in Johannesburg, and he was working on negotiations with the chief of the Zulu tribe, Chief Buthelezi, and Nelson Mandela were working to repair relationships between the ANC and the Zulus. And and Tony, met with world leaders, but he he was just not, he didn't take that serious, like he didn't take himself seriously. He really did, was just would be with you when he was with you, and as if you were the most important person in the world, and he just treated
Okay.
everybody that way.
All
um
right.
Anyways, just uh, learned a lot working for Tony. Good man.
Um, I like your reference to integrity, integer, whole, not fractionated. I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. Can you get a little closer to the microphone again? Okay. I want them to hear every word. So then, what was your first headmaster post? Your
Was a school called Spruce Hill Christian School in West Philly.
Okay,
And that school merged with another school, a high school. It was a K-8, and then we took over a high school, and then it eventually merged with another school, and it's now called the City School. But I was there for 15 years
okay. As head.
as head of school.
Oh, I tell you, you know, um, grace to be with you, my son. 15
Oh,
years. Oh
it's
my God.
yeah. So and that served a predominant, a significant percentage of the students were on scholarship. Maybe 70% of the students were on
Mm-hmm.
scholarship. So it was geared towards the under-resourced community in Philadelphia, particularly West and Southwest Philly.
Okay. So then you went to the Dominican Republic for 9 years,
I was, yeah,
and
it was.
what drew you there?
Well, I mean, I was actually recruited, just as schools will do when they're doing a search for a new head of school.
Mm-hmm.
And I happened to know some people. Honestly, was not planning on leaving Philadelphia. Certainly wasn't planning on leaving the country. And I had never studied, I'd never learned Spanish or ever studied it. And But I knew some people, and there were a couple of people recruiting me, and I just through different circumstances, I felt like my time potentially was done at the city school. A lot had been accomplished, and just a number of things in your life prompt you to.
Hmm. Oh yeah. So
And so anyway, I allowed I told the president of the board of the city school, like, hey, I'm going to fly down to the DR. I'm going to take a look at this thing. And I went down there, and then I was down there for a day, and then my wife flew down with one of my children. I had older kids who were off to college, but the next one was going into ninth grade at the time. And I felt like she had, watched her older siblings do high school with us, in Philly, and this was going to be a big change. So Anne brought Sarah down to visit. We were there another couple of days, and we flew back, and sitting in the Miami airport waiting for our connection, we decided this is what God had for us. And
okay.
so
So I presume the classes were conducted in Spanish.
So no, it is it would be referred, it's an international American school. It
I
happens to
see.
be Christian.
Okay.
So Santiago Christian School in the city of Santiago, which is the second largest city in the country. It's kind of in the middle of the country in an area referred to as the Cibao Valley. It's a beautiful country. But we loved living in the DR. And though I was, I think, the eighth headmaster in 11 years when I got there, it had a lot of turnover. And so
Now
there
I
was
have
a
a
lot of
question
work
for
to.
you in terms of leadership. You know, before I founded the eight principles, I was in higher education for a number of years as chief advancement officers, and I was at what, four schools, I think. And one of the warning bells that always looked at me is if I was looking at a job for which there'd been a lot of turnover. You begin to think, so what's the problem here? The revolving door? Is it the leader? Is it this? What's going on? So how did you evaluate that? I mean, if you're looking at an organization where there was not that much stability in leadership, uh, what questions did you ask yourself? How did you resolve those?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that when you're a head of school and you interact with other heads of school, you're aware of how critical the board is
Oh
of
yes.
a school. And, you know, unless you're the head of school or an upper executive administrator, you do not see much of the board. But the board is the keeper of the vision.
Mhm.
And when I think they have three main functions that a board has. One is the hiring, supervision, and replacement of the CEO. That is, and number two, they have the fiduciary responsibility that comes
Mhm.
with the board. And so I like to think of, you know, in driving a car, that's kind of the rear view mirror. They're always looking at, how did the quarter end? How did last year end? The fiduciary responsibility. And then when you're driving a car, you have the windshield, and, they help set the budget and vote on the budget. And they supervise the CEO, but most of their time should be looking at the GPS, at how are we going to navigate from this point to where we're headed? And they should set that vision. And then their evaluation of me should really be about, how is Seth executing the strategic plan? Is he
Mhm.
moving us down the road? And they don't get to say whether, I do it this way or that way necessarily, but how I, um, and so they have to help support the strategic plan, help to resource, help to make that the priority for me. And so when I was in Philadelphia, I worked for a really excellent board who had just tremendous gifts and talents that they brought to bear on growing this little school from a single campus to multiple campuses, serving again in a challenging environment. In the DR, I found a very different situation, which is, I think, is why you saw a revolving door. And probably a wiser leader may have asked more questions
Mhm.
about, like, why am I number 9 or number 8
Why
in
am I
line?
number 9?
Um, so it but I will say I learned a lot from that experience. I learned so much from being in the Dominican culture. Um, I felt like in some ways the school was a blend of some of the best. Every culture has its positives and negatives, but
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, I like to think that Santiago Christian School had sort of the best of both cultures in this really unique Christian school, U.S. accredited. Um, it's referred to as a monolingual school. So by
Okay.
by government law, you had to teach some subjects in Spanish, but the majority of the subjects were taught in English. Um, and so that's how a non-speaking Spanish person could be the head of a school in the Dominican Republic.
Well, I suspect you had some colleagues and juniors who were expert in the language and could help you when you needed it.
Yeah, I had a couple. I had an amazing executive assistant who was a tremendous translator, another gentleman on staff who would travel with me. And because even those who, master the language quickly, which was not me, when you have an important conversation, you still need a translator there because you can't mess it, you can't mess it up. Like you got to make sure so you need not someone who can just translate but understand what you're trying to say and make sure the meaning of what you're saying is true. If you're dealing with a discipline situation or a financial situation, you got to get those things right. So and
I saw that that sense of understanding the idiom very, very well come was on national international display last week when President Zelensky was in the Oval Office and President Trump is telling him, "You don't have many cards to play," and he says, we're not playing cards," or he didn't understand the euphemism that Trump was trying to
right,
say, that you don't have a very strong negotiating hand. But it was clear to me that he didn't understand the idiom.
right,
English is not his native language. And I thought, there's a perfect example of why having expert translators or know that you to get your point across, so
yeah,
you're communicating. Um, um, all right, Seth. Now we're going to get to the hard part of the
okay,
podcast. Okay, because let's get ready for this. All right.
all right,
I've been throwing you softballs up to this point.
all right. You
Okay.
can throw it hard now.
We're in a tremendous cultural upheaval. It's been coming for 20 or 30 years. You see it, and what we've been seeing in the last 10, especially, where people of faith are openly attacked, where the very foundations of some of the things that this country took for granted have been seriously questioned. People like Jordan Peterson would say it's the ascent of hedonism and nihilism, and he talks about Christianity being the ultimate model of self-sacrifice, which it is. And so you, or meaning the big U, Christians, are in some ways sort of outliers. Now, in recent months, or maybe a year, we've seen sort of a beginning of swinging in the other direction. I think the election in November indicated some of that. But what do you see? Two things. What are the cultural, no, let me rephrase that. What do you think the number one cultural challenge is for a student in a Christian school? How do they react? I mean, do you prepare them for the outside world? Do you shield them? How do you handle that in a hostile cultural environment?
So let me step back and give you my perspective on the cultural moment we find ourselves in. Um, there is not another moment in history to the present that I would want to be doing the work that I do than right now. This is the best moment for Christian education in my lifetime, in my 36 years of Christian education. This is the cultural moment that God has given us. You use the word, I think you said Christians are the outlier. Is that
They're now in the minority,
yeah.
professing Christians.
But I like that word, and I hadn't thought of it. But I think the church was always supposed to be the outlier. And
interesting you say that. Yeah.
What has been distressing for me is when the church isn't the outlier, when we didn't stand up for the oppressed, those who are sidelined, those who are maligned, those who are harassed and abused, when the church did not lead where it should. So we always should have been the outlier. And so to me, this is the moment. I live in a cultural moment. So having 8 children spanning from my youngest is 16, my oldest is 34. I've watched, so I have children from different generations.
You do.
And in this cultural moment, my 2 youngest are daughters. And then I a young man in college, 21, 18, and 16. In this cultural moment, the sum of my children's identity, the culture is telling them, is found in who you are sexually attracted to. That is the sum of your personhood. And if that changes on Tuesday, you're good. Like, you be you. I have so much better message to deliver for them. That you are a child of the Most High God. You're an image bearer. And you have a story. You have a beautiful story and you are not the author. And the author of that story has a grand story that your story is part of. And you get to live your story in a grand story. And by the way, I know how the story ends.
I love that, Seth. I love that.
So for me, there's never been a better moment. Now, I am not blind to the assault upon the fabric of God's creation. And what is life? What is gender? What is truth? Yes. But I think in this moment, the life and teachings of Jesus will stand on its own. It won't need me yelling about it. It won't need me running for the hills. I don't need to hunker down. And I will say, Larry, back in 1986, I spent the better part of the summer in communist Romania with a mission team from my college. There they were persecuted and suffered. It's hard, and looking at those who have suffered, around the world, it's hard for me to feel like a suffering minority in the United States.
You said 86. I'm going to make sure I get my facts. Had the curtain come down by 86?
No, it was still Nicolae Ceausescu was the communist dictator.
All right.
So it was 86. It was the summer of 86 or 7. I'd have to think back, but it was my junior year summer.
That's right, because it was 89 when the Berlin Wall was breached. It was 89. So the Eastern Bloc was still together.
Yeah.
At that point.
And so I don't know. It's hard to feel a victim when you see what's happening in other parts of the world where, you'll lose your life. And so, yeah, I guess someone could say something unkind about us. And I don't know. So for me, this is a great moment to be in Christian education. Um, and you know, I'm very optimistic. Um, but
Well,
you know,
well,
anyway, so I see it a little differently.
well, I think it's a good difference. Uh, you see it as an opportunity. You see it as a moment of real authenticity, an opportunity. You're a warrior, Seth. You may have a suit on right now, but you've got the warrior mindset for sure.
Well, I do share, like, I share with my staff and parents who are of faith, like we war for the hearts of our children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we war against an enemy that is very good at what he does. And whether it was in an urban setting like Philadelphia or in the Dominican Republic or here in Jupiter, Florida, very different places, um, you war for the hearts of kids. And Satan uses the culture around them because he wants them to love and worship the wrong things that will lead to their ruin and disaster. And so that game has been being played back when I was in Philadelphia, when I was in the DR, and now in 2025 here in Jupiter, Florida. So I think the game is the same. And
It just occurred to me as I'm listening to you. Um, Satan has always been very subtle. His attacks are generally very oblique, not frontal. And in the last maybe 5 or maybe 10 years, but 5 years especially, his attacks have become more focused and more frontal because he feels he has sort of the upper hand. And it's like I'm a Tolkien fan, Seth.
okay.
All right, and in Tolkien, it's when things reach a certain point that Sauron feels he has the upper hand and he can be far more direct than he was before. And but it's actually a way of galvanizing opposition at the same time. And you see it, it's more obvious. So in some ways, your job has gotten a little easier. There's this and there's this,
Yeah.
you know.
And I agree with you. I think when evil masks itself as light, um, then it's far more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but so having worked in, in I like to say when I was in Philly, I sort of worked with third world kids living in the first world. And in the Dominican Republic, I worked with first world kids living in the third world. Um, and
Now, run that by me one more time. I want the audience to understand what you just said.
because I was dealing with an under-resourced population in Philadelphia,
Mm-hmm.
um, but they were living in a first world country. And then in the Dominican Republic, I was in because it was an American school with a healthy tuition, a very small percentage of the Dominicans could afford to send their children to the Santiago Christian School. The it was founded as a missionary school, but by the time I got there, I would say maybe 90% of the students were not missionary kids. They were from the broader community, some from the international business community, but predominantly the affluent of the region in Santiago sent their kids there, not necessarily because it was a Christian school, but it aligned with the Catholic traditions, and they sent them there because it was an American U.S. English education.
And
Um,
they got good academic outcomes and Christian
yeah,
values, and that's
yeah.
what they were looking for.
And now I'm in Jupiter, and in all of these schools, enrollment was not. We didn't require families to sign a statement of faith. You had to sign a statement of cooperation, like you understood that you're sending your child to Christian school, but you didn't have to be of faith to send your kids to any of the schools I've worked at. Um, the but in all those situations, um, you're warring against the culture that is assaulting the children, and in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, I think Jupiter is the hardest place. Um, because I think a culture of affluence and self-sufficiency and entitlement, some
Oh,
is the most dangerous for a child's heart.
hmm. Oh, it is. Um, you said something I want to go back. This whole, I mean, I know that Christian schools sort of divide along this line, those that are covenantal, that require faith commitment, and those that are not. Can you tell me a little bit about the pros and cons of doing it each way and why you're on the side you're on?
Yeah, I mean, you don't want your experience to inform your theology, but because my mom sent me to a Christian school that was a covenant school, but somehow, you know,
Well, you
played the
answered,
system.
you answered gave the right answer to the question, Seth. That's how that happened.
So, but like I said, I think the principal wasn't duped by my mom.
Yeah, he saw through her, I'm sure.
And but he took compassion on me. Again, God's faithfulness. I I personally don't understand the covenant model. I think as I've been a Presbyterian for a while. I think I understand covenant theology. Um, I don't understand how it's applied in this case. I, I by keeping certain children out, you think you're protecting the light, and if I have to protect the light, then we're in trouble,
Yeah.
because the light will win, the darkness will recede. They are not equal. Um, but if I have my board and all of my staff are followers of Jesus and are playing from a discipleship model for education, where we're educating the heart and the mind, then we'll enroll children who go to church and don't go to church. And I will tell you, Larry, in all of my years, um, when it really matters that a parent partners with the school, when we have tough situations and we're in partnership, there's almost nothing we can't overcome. But
Hmm.
that can be really a challenge to when kids are struggling and making poor choices. Um, and when that partnership is there, it's really, when that partnership is not there, it's really hard. And I have to tell you that the recipe to have a good partnership, church membership has not been a noted ingredient to make it successful. I've
That's
partnered equally
interesting.
well with
Well,
non-church families and church families.
we look at the example of Jesus when he was on earth, and of course, he always looked at a person's heart, not their position or standing in society, whatever that might be. And I mean, you're on good ground in that he didn't have any litmus test. He evaluated a person's heart. And because, well, not to throw any rotten tomatoes at our more conservative friends, but he had his number one arguments and opposition from the established religious hierarchy at the time. And
Yeah.
and they really thought they were doing the right thing. Some people think, oh, they were such bad guys. Well, no, they really weren't. They had perhaps gotten sort of what ossified, but they really believed that they were following the law and following God's will.
Yep.
And this
No,
man,
their zeal for the law and their expertise. So when the law became flesh, it was unrecognizable.
yeah, it's like, what the hell is this? This challenges everything we have ever accepted. And I like to tell people, I love to say this: Jesus was not a nice person. All right, and they kind of look at me, and I say, listen, compassionate, loving, forgiving, yes. Nice, go along to get along? No. And I said, you don't crucify Mr. Rogers. You have to seriously displease people to get crucified. And he had some serious enemies. And of course, today is Ash Wednesday, the holiest time of the year. So,
And I do think, I mean, to think about it, Larry, if you and your wife came to my school, maybe you're from a Catholic tradition and you attend mass, sometimes you don't, like, or you're, of no faith, or, you know, um, and you come to my school and somehow I'm feeling, well, you're not going to an evangelical church and you want to send your 6-year-old to my school. Somehow your 6-year-old poses a threat to my community. Like, I don't get that. I don't understand how that covenant theology works in that way. And if, in my opinion, if you adhere to covenant theology, which, then those are the ones who should embrace open enrollment, right?
Yeah,
That thing's all locked up.
yeah. It's a sort of a, I think most of it is born out of fear, Seth, and insecurity, because, or a lack of understanding that God's in charge.
Yeah.
Ultimately, God's in charge.
Yeah.
And we're junior partners in his enterprise.
Again, I think covenant theology is built around the supremacy of Christ and the sufficiency. And so I think it should lend itself to open enrollment. But again, I have strong opinions, but ask my wife, I'm often wrong. So,
well, we're certainly, I think, on the right, on the same side of this argument, for sure. I mean, my background, Anglican, Arminianism. I mean, there are evangelicals that would look at me, oh, really? And I go to a Nazarene church now, mainly because the Anglican church in the United States has sort of jumped off the left side of the planet. So I go to a Nazarene church. I go to the Eucharist in the morning at 8. And it's very simple. As I tell people, no smells, no bells, but it's very simple. And then if I'm really feeling a little bit on the ornery side, I'll say, I go to worship at 8. You go to the circus at 10:30, and then they gotta go, whoa, whoa, whoa. But yeah, it's that. And we recently got a new minister, a delightful young man. In fact, I'm having lunch with him today, and he'd never done a formal Eucharist before, and it's in the order of book, the order of worship in the Nazarene Church, and it was right there. But he had to get some guidance the first time. He's like, okay, now what do I do? Now what do I do? Now he's sort of gotten into it. But a lot of it's lack of experience, something unfamiliar, and not appreciating what's really being said there. So, okay. What's next, Seth?
So, I do, as you alluded, it's a really fascinating time
Yeah,
to
it
be doing.
is.
And thus, like I said, I'm so glad I get to do it at this moment. And it is just such I will tell you, I love what I do. And
It's obvious.
it is, I had the best job. But I think there are still really, for me coming in the Christian school movement, there are really significant challenges. One is, overall school choice is growing in this country. And you look at it by state, because it's usually determined at the state level. And there are winners and losers, gains and losses. But I think if you look at the overall trajectory, school choice is growing. And I see that as a very positive trend. But in anything, there's winners and losers. And I have concerns for how that will affect the most vulnerable children. As it is, Christian education, for the most part, is not very accessible to the poor.
Let's talk about that for a minute. What role, or I don't know how much you considered this, but you're a smart guy. You probably have thought about it a lot. What role does philanthropy play for you in your school?
Well, everywhere I've been, philanthropy has played a role. From in Philadelphia, where a significant percentage of the budget had to go just to keep the lights on and make payroll. The Dominican Republic, it was a little different. We were raising money for partner schools that were In the barrio and nearby. There were
Hmm.
schools that we were supporting, and then philanthropy to help expand the school and construct some buildings. Here in Jupiter, maybe 6% of my operating budget is covered by the annual fund, which goes to scholarships. We also have a really strong neurodiversity community. About 18% of my students has an ILP. I have a whole department across the grades from 2 years old through 12th grade. We have specialists working with students with individual learning plans and diagnosed learning disabilities,
Okay.
and which is rare for private schools to have such a large program, which is one of the reasons I was drawn to Jupiter.
Okay.
Was that commitment to neurodiversity. But I do think we're in our vision in our school statement of vision is that we're an accessible school. We'll enroll any child regardless of their ability to pay.
Okay.
And so we have a strong scholarship program. We have funds that are dedicated to the Jupiter Police Department. We have a new fire department starting here in Jupiter, and we'll likely do the same thing for our first responders. We're aware that every day we hire JPD to be on our campuses. We're
That's
good enough for
Jupiter
them to,
Police Department, correct?
yeah, Jupiter Police Department. So I don't want to be the place where I expect you to come and sacrifice your life to protect my students, but you can't send your own children here. So we want to be accessible.
Okay. Have you made, I know traditionally in an independent school, the support comes from, well, the independent support comes from parents and maybe past parents. And with a few schools, a few alumni, and then some grandparents, have you been able to significantly enlarge your constituency beyond that? And if you haven't, would you like to? I mean, what do you think you'd like
Yeah,
to
I will
accomplish?
say I've got a tremendous team. We have 1,100 students spread across two campuses, and then I have a very small 50 student campus, early childhood at a local church. But I really built a strong team, and I'm really blessed in that way. But when I got here in 2020, I think the budget called for us to raise around $300,000 in maybe a $17 million operating budget.
Hmm.
And last year we raised close to $3 million. Maybe
Congratulations.
half of that annual, the other half was for capital projects.
Okay.
So we've seen a really significant increase in giving, and most of that's from our own constituency,
Okay.
parents, grandparents, alums.
Okay. All right. So, what is it that we haven't covered that you're just dying to tell me, Seth?
Um, I don't know. I'm dying to tell you. I do. Again, I'll go back to sort of when you said we're going to start. The harder question was, we live as the people of hope, and we know how the story ends, and to not live with joy and compassion, and even those who we see as so against the very fundamental beliefs, to not to this idea it's us against them,
Hmm. Very
right?
adversarial.
And I think there's something really lost there when we pause and reflect. They're dust, I'm dust. There's just us, and then God sent Jesus,
Hmm.
right? And it's us and him. And some of us have figured it out that he's the answer, and others haven't yet. And how do we be salt and light? Um, I don't think Jesus has called us to anger. that's anger doesn't produce anything. But he's called us to sacrifice. Um, I am so now. Believe me, I do see the unique heritage we have in the United States and the founding principles on which we were built was something amazing. We haven't always lived up to those principles and often fell far short of the founding principles, but they're
See,
there.
and I want to point out that it was the American experience that stated that our rights come not from government, but from God, that they originate from Him, not from a civil government, which is unique in the world, by the way. At least it was at the time. Um, you were talking about, um, well, I'm sure you watched, if not all of it, a portion of The Chosen.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh,
Excellent.
well, anyway, I was a slow comer to that. And the
Mhm.
reason why is, I have a really sensitive cheese meter. All right. And a lot of Jesus films are very typical. They're very two-dimensional. They don't really communicate, or it's just outright propaganda, one or the other. And so then when I heard the podcast that Dallas Jenkins did with Jordan Peterson last fall, I thought, I better go look at this. And so, because if Peterson doesn't think it's cheesy, it must be pretty good. So I've just binge watched the whole thing, and I'm really now at the holy season, the Passover, and the new editions are coming out. But one thing that really struck me, they've done a superb job of making the person of Jesus three-dimensional. This is a real person,
Yeah.
and he was also, and that whole idea of fully human, fully God. What does that? How does that really look? What does it look like? You know, and that's one of the, I think, characteristics of the way he's portrayed. That what Rumi's done is, there are plenty of things he doesn't like, and he expresses his displeasure, but he restrains his outright anger. We're coming up on the scenes where I'm told he clears the temple, and I'm anxious to see how that's portrayed. But you made a very important point. You don't feel the need to get into diatribes or shouting matches or one-upsmanship. I really like that, Seth. Just don't let it go to your head. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
No, Larry, I've
Okay.
appreciated your book and just the principles of fundraising. Those are built on biblical principles, and
Yes,
you
they
know,
are actually.
and
Yeah.
it was really great to with my team we've been at different times. When we have my advancement team meet, which includes admissions, marketing, communications, and development is
Mm-hmm.
it's all under the umbrella of advancement. But I'll bring a portion of that and read it to affirm the good things that are going on, or is there a better
Mm-hmm.
way we could be doing something? So
Okay. All right.
it's been a good piece for us.
Well, I'm glad you like it. We also do interactive workshops that you can use on your own. I learned that from Stephen Covey, by the way. That and then of course John Maxwell does something similar. But both of those are in leadership. But it's interesting you say the biblical principles. When I wrote the book, I didn't deliberately write it with that in mind, but it's just what came out of my own experience and my own understanding of how life works. And it was like, oh yeah, look at this. And then a year after A Principles was published, Henry Nouwen's The Spirituality of Fundraising was published. And that was published posthumously, by the way. Henry was already deceased. And that was put together by his editor, John McGab. And I looked at it and I went, wow, this is the Principles with the scripture added. It was
Yeah.
like, and I didn't know. Well, it's kind of nice to know. It's kind of an affirmation when you try to do the best you can do, and like, oh, look, I'm being affirmed in another way here. So anyway, that's
But it's the maxim. I all truth is God's truth. And so,
Yes, it
you know,
is.
and that flows out of your heart that is committed to Christ. And so here are the principles of fundraising. You can't help but have that flow out of your pen, you know, because
Hmm.
that's who you are. And so, you think about how intentional Jesus was with every encounter. Um, Even though he was headed here, right? Who touched me? Sir, my my slave is sick, my daughter is sick, right? He was never, you know, not aware of who was in front of him. Um, and you really talk about that in your book and the principle of how you treat someone who's being philanthropic towards your organization. It's not about the money; it's about the relationship that between you. And so it just flows right out of your own faith.
Well, I like the word Jesus was intentional. And there again, I've just recently finished The Chosen, and I was so touched by it. Look, that's exactly the right word. He was always intentional. He had places to do, things to happen, but whatever he did, his focus was always on the moment, even though he had a bigger vision in mind. Very intentional. Well, you're certainly intentional, Seth. I mean, this has really been a delight for me. Thank you. I
Well,
just
thank you, Larry. This is I'm very blessed to do what I do, and God has been so good to me.
okay. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've just been a delightful hour with Seth Cohen, who's the headmaster or head of school of Capital Jupiter Christian School in Jupiter, Florida. And I've learned a lot, Seth, by the way. Thank you very much. And I've been inspired, and I hope you will be too. Next, we'll do another leader in the thought world, the philanthropic world, the faith based world. So stay tuned.
Larry, thanks for having me. It's great to be together.
My